All right, I think let's just go ahead and get started. So first on the agenda, I wanted to share that the meeting schedule for this meeting has changed. The time is exactly the same, but instead of being every 2 weeks, we've switched to a weekly meeting. The reason for this is that we used to do one public community meeting one week and then a internal approvers meeting the second week and then switching it back and forth. We've decided that the approvers meeting is no longer really necessary, and there's enough content in the community meetings that we can meet more frequently to try to work through some of these issues. If we find that the frequency of these meetings is too frequent, we can switch back to a 2 week schedule, but we can play that by ear. And that is all. With that, I'll hand it off to Xing to talk about snapshots. You go ahead, Xing.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ed. So in last meeting, we talked about some of the review comments. I think we finished 3 items that we listed last time. I want to double check on this one item that we talked about last time. We decided to get rid of get snapshot, and we now just have a create snapshot and the list snapshots. I just want to see if anyone has any more comments on that, or are we all set with this decision? So,
could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, sure. So in last meeting, we have decided to remove get snapshot, which is to wait for the upload to complete. So now we only have a create snapshot, which is it's a blocking call that will wait until the snapshot is cut. But after that, some storage systems will continue to upload the snapshot somewhere in the cloud. So we no longer have another separate call for that. Instead, CO can call list snapshots to get the status of the snapshot. So whether the upload is complete or not, we can find out by calling list snapshots. So I just want to see if anyone has any other concerns on this, or are we all set with this?
So to be clear, instead of having a separate list and get, the proposal is just to have a single list. And if you want to select a single snapshot, you would do a filter on the list.
Oh, yes, yeah. So okay. List snapshots can pass in a snapshot ID to filter out, yeah.
Okay, and I think the concern around using the list was that if the object to return was supposed to return an error for some reason, it's in a weird state, that would be difficult to represent. Was that resolved?
I think Jean said she will look into whether we need to get more detailed status on that. I haven't got a chance to sync up with her on that because I was traveling last week.
Okay. So I think my conversations with Jing, she mentioned that we could introduce a third status, which would be an error state. The problem with just an enum is that it doesn't give you a descriptive enough error. So we could possibly add in a string description, which could be used to return a descriptive error. But that starts getting into a little bit of a weird territory where you're kind of reconstructing everything that gRPC gives you, detailed description and an error code. That said, if this is what folks agreed on, I'm not going to push back too hard on it. Anybody else have any thoughts or opinions about the using list instead of get and list?
So this is Chunhan from Mesosphere. Have you guys considered what James suggested, which used the return value of create to get a status?
The return value of create. So the create, for the create snapshot, it will also return status as well. So instead of using list, can we use a create snapshot? CO call create snapshot? repeatedly. Okay, so that's also possible. I don't know if it's easier, because if we are not calling get snapshot as a separate operation, basically we're still bundling everything into the same call, right? So create snapshot can probably give you another error code, but then you can still use that in the list snapshots. I believe list snapshot with the snapshot ID can give you the same thing.
I guess the difference would be that if you use create snapshot, you wouldn't necessarily have to worry about how you handle the weird error cases on the list side. You could have a descriptive error code returned on the create volume call.
And the create is going to be a blocking call versus the list that is not.
Well, but the create cannot be blocking after it's cut, though, because otherwise, how do you know when to resume the application? That was the initial reason why we have two calls, right?
Yeah. It seems like the create will block only when the application cannot continue, right?
Right.
So to me, I don't know, create couldn't return immediately, but maybe we can do both. I mean, I'm not against that create returning, like, it's moving to the cloud, and list can say the same thing. And
and then it's up to the CEO to decide which one they want to use.
Yeah, I mean, that would be fine.
So create will be blocking until it's cut, and after that, it will not be blocking. It will just be returning the status, same as the.
Yeah, I think that's the intended behavior of the create call anyway. Create is supposed to be idempotent, and if you call create a second time, it is the intention of the spec that it should return the same object again, just information about it instead of creating a new object. So that should already be the case, and then it should be up to the CEO whether they want to use the create call or use the filtered list call. But it sounds like we have consensus. It sounds like we do not want to introduce a get snapshot call at this point. We'll do a list call with the filter, and then potentially folks could use the create snapshot call, calling it repeatedly to get a new status on it. And then in the future, if we decide that we really need a get snapshot, we could introduce it because it's an additive change. I'm okay with that. Anything else you want to discuss?
I think that's pretty much for this one. And then last time we didn't get a chance to talk about item number 4 on my list. Basically,
could you share your screen? I'm having trouble.
Oh, sure. Okay. Yeah, I was just looking at the agenda basically. So here, right, last time we talked about we're trying to talk about the items from the review, and then this last one, we haven't got a chance to talk about it. But I see that there's an item added at the bottom, but this one basically, whether we should also make create snapshot a RPC in the node.
Oh, yes.
So that's one item that we have not got a chance to talk about last time.
Yes, hi. This is Elias. Do you want me to summarize about it, or are you going to do it?
Yeah, you can go ahead and talk about this.
Okay, thank you. So the problem we're facing here is that our CSI storage plugin caches part of the volume locally during node publish, let's say by using DM cache. So in order for our plugin to implement snapshot functionality, we need the create snapshot RPC to reach the node plugin, the node service.
So sorry, Doug, can you walk through the concrete use cases here? I think reading through your comments, it sounded like it was for caching. Is that correct?
Yes, this is our case.
Okay, and so basically the idea is that if there's some sort of local caching going on, there must be a part of the snapshot creation process that is executed on the node.
Yes, exactly, because during node publish, you are executing code on the node, So there has to be a way during create snapshot to execute code on the node. So this is just our, yes, please.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, this is just our case. I'm thinking other cases like having local volumes using LVM, but I don't think that CSI covers local volumes right now. I think that this is on the roadmap, but I'm not sure about this.
Yeah. So my next question would be, how common is this? It sounds like it could be useful for local volumes. Are there other storage systems where this could be useful?
I'm not aware of any right now.
So my gut reaction is, let's start with a minimal interface first. So let's start with the controller create snapshot.
Okay, yeah, I agree with that. I just want to discuss about it and see.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's a useful use case. I don't think we need to start off with it immediately, and maybe this is something we can add in additively in the future. But yeah, if there's anything else you want to talk about, feel free.
Another idea would be to have a prepare snapshot on the node service, which will be called right after freezing the application, but before calling the create snapshot on the controller service.
Yeah, basically the same idea that the same problem that we have on the controller create snapshot of there is a portion that will be required for the application to freeze, and then there's a portion required for actually preparing the snapshot.
Exactly.
The same idea would apply to the node side.
Yes, yes. I believe the same problem will be with create volume if we decide to add local volumes later on.
So how about for now, let's make sure that could you review the design to make sure that if we were to add this change in the future, we don't make any decisions right now that would block it from happening. But for this initial iteration, let's start with just controller, and then we can revise in the future.
Yeah, sure. I'm fine with that.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
All right, cool. Is there anything else around snapshots that needs attention?
I don't have anything.
Okay. Then we can move on to the next item. And for snapshots, we'll take a look at it offline, and hopefully we can get that merged soon. If Xing, you can update the PR with the latest feedback.
Sure.
Then we'll go ahead and get that approved and merged. Luis, you're up next.
Hi guys. So my discussion is around what's called CSI Sanity. And just give you background to those who are new to it. There is an application that we created as part of the Kubernetes CSI team. It's part of the repo called CSI test, and we have a number of tests for both COs and for driver developers. And as part of the driver developer test is a package called Sanity. That package called Sanity has, I don't know, Xing, you're still sharing your screen, I think, just to let you know. Or somebody's still sharing the screen. There you go. And so that package called Sanity has an application and Golang package that can be included and can be used to test your drivers to make sure that they conform to the API. So that's all this application does. And we had met with multiple developers of different testing programs, and the team, part of the CSI community, chose this application to be used to continue using it as part of the container CS storage interface community that we are. So one of the things that we have to do is bring this repo from the Kubernetes CSI team, GitHub, to the container storage CSI repo. Now, one of the discussions, and this is what I'm bringing up here, is that the discussion was to bring it as part of the same repo as the spec, And what I'm trying to suggest instead is to bring it as a different repo, but still in the same team in GitHub. Now, I'll explain both sides. It was suggested to be part of the spec, so that anytime a new change will come to the spec, that change, that PR will also have a change to the testing program, right? And I can see why that's necessary, but one of the things that I see in the community is that PRs change very often, and there's a lot of discussions. So from the testing point of view, it's actually much easier for us to see the final change. Like, for example, take a snapshot, for example, there's been a lot of discussions of which API to go through and things like that. But once it is finished, it's actually very easy to then make a change in the test code and then release it. So that's why I'm here proposing that instead of being part of the same spec repo, that we are instead part of the same team, container storage interface / CSI test. And then as soon as a PR is merged, we then take that PR and then takes less than a day to make a change to have it conform, to test drivers who conform to it. So that's my proposal, and want to see what you guys thought. Crickets.
I like it separate personally.
Yeah.
I don't like it crammed in the same repo.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think if we keep it separate, we should update our release process to include some kind of wording about making sure that the sanity repo, whatever we call it, has been updated.
Yep, I agree.
Everything is in sync. And that we also have kind of a documented process for making sure that if we tag like CSI v0.3, that we're also tagging the sanity stuff, the sanity repo, in a way that makes it clear like which tests apply to which spec version.
Completely agree. And actually, what we do today is that we tag our repo with the same version as the spec. That way it's not confusing. And actually, one of the things that somebody brought up, I forgot who it was, in one of our discussions about this, was that we could have a bot that when it merges, it just creates an issue in CSI test so that we can track it. So. We could probably just rename the repos. It was to be called CSI test, but I think CSI sanity is better repo name.
I think there's already a CSI test which never got used. Oh no, I guess we must have deleted it. But yeah, I like CSI sanity. It's like a sanity checker. Test is too broad.
Yep, great.
I think that sounds like a good idea. Having a separate repo makes things easier to version and release independently. The challenge here is that we actually do want to release this in line with the spec release, which is why the original proposal was maybe they should be part of the same repository. But I can understand the challenges of sharing the same repository. As long as we have something like what you suggested, a bot that'll create an issue to make sure that we don't lose track of any changes in the spec, as well as documenting the process for releasing updates. Actually, I'd like to discuss this part. So if we cut a release, should we just do 2 parallel releases? So when we do a 0.3 release of spec, we also do a 0.3 release of sanity?
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with that. That's actually what we do today in CSI in the other repo. So
okay.
Yeah.
I think that seems reasonable. And then anybody who wants to verify their driver can then pull the 0.3 version of the CSI sanity and run their driver against it to make sure that it works. That seems reasonable to me. Anybody disagree? Anybody think that it should be in the same repo?
I have a question about the bot statement. We don't have any infrastructure. So when I say we, I mean the container storage interface organization. So I don't know where a bot would run. Someone would have to donate something, right?
Yeah, I'm betting this will happen post CNCF. It'll be probably a to-do until then. Once we get into CNCF, we can reuse probably the same bots that Kubernetes has.
Do we have Travis today?
We do, yes.
Okay, we'll try to see if we can do something with Travis. But
Okay.
but yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else about this issue before we move on to the next one?
Thank you, guys.
All right. Thanks, Luis. Next up is Hemant, and he has a proposal for enabling CSI drivers to specify the maximum number of volumes that can be attached to a single node. Take it away, Hemant.
Yeah, so this is a quite simple proposal. I have I think there's a PR also open for with the actual change. Yeah. So there's some discussion going on about the naming, and there's a discussion ongoing about like the whether the CSI should also expose like how many volumes are attached to a node, and that's where I think the confusion is, and like currently I don't think that it is needed in CSI, and we can always add it because the most COs can figure it out by for example Kubernetes can figure out by checking running parts. Other COs, if there's a need, we can always add a list volumes call to the node API. But yeah, I don't know what everybody thinks about this one. So
Oops. Okay, so it sounds like there's 3 open questions. One is which call should this information be part of? 2 is what should it be called? And then 3 is do we need a corresponding bit of information that tells us how many volumes are already attached in addition to the total capacity that's supported?
yeah, how many volumes are attached to a node like that? So
okay, so maybe let's talk about the third one first. I think for the other calls, like getting the capacity for a volume, we decided that we will only return the capacity and not the usage, and that the CO would keep track of usage. So my initial gut reaction is that maybe we should just follow the same pattern and have the capacity here and leave the CO to figure out the actual usage. But I can see the counterpoint, which is what if the CO loses track of this information? On the capacity, on the usage of a particular volume, a CO could theoretically run DF or something on the volume to figure it out. For the number of volumes attached, if it doesn't have a way to probe the volume plugin and it loses track, it really won't be able to figure it out.
it depends, right? If it's like in if the CO can know how many workloads are running and using that volume, then it can figure it out. And I mean, the only way it will truly lose that information is if the whatever the database that CO was using is gone or corrupt or
Yeah, or somebody goes around the CO and mounts a volume or attaches a volume somewhere.
yeah, somebody attaches a volume outside the scope of CO. That's true.
So the problem that I have with this is that what's been proposed so far is a field in the spec that reports essentially some kind of resource usage that's particular to a plugin implementation, and it's a threshold value, right?
Yeah.
And there's no way to query the plugin for what the current value is. All you can see is the threshold value. And the assertions that are being made that, oh, some COs can figure this out, it's not entirely clear to me how that can be done generically, because this is like a plugin specific resource usage value, right? Like it's number of slots on a host or bananas in a box, like whatever it is, right?
Mm.
There's no way for a CO to know what the plugin is doing under the covers and how many of this particular kind of resource the plugin's actually consumed, because it's not actually reported through any CSI API.
Yeah, I think in generic sense, if you look at it like it depends on the CO's implementation. Like in Kubernetes, we are fortunate to have that track. In other COs, it might be difficult, like to know how many volumes of that type are in use on a node. And I kind of see that point, but I want to see if there's we can basically go back to the whiteboard and always add that API call, right? Like that's what I was thinking, because this proposal that, okay, we need a list, we need the threshold, and if CO like Docker or whoever needs that information and cannot derive that information on its own, we can add it pretty much, and without being fully backward compatible and everything. So I just feel that it's not needed right now. It's like if CO needs it, we add it. That's what my thought process.
So instead of doing a count and trying to have like a count of the number of volumes attached to a node, maybe we should just have a failure code that no more can be attached to this node.
So that's a different use case. I mean, that I think the plugins implicitly do that already.
Right.
The use case here is that we have in the scheduler today for Kubernetes a limit that it sets, and we need to make sure that that limit, we have a way to figure out what that limit is. So I think we do need a way to be able to say what is the hard number that you support. Definitely need that. The open question is around, okay, in addition to that, how do we know how many are currently in use? The CO could theoretically figure that out based on the workloads that have been scheduled, but it could lose track of that for some reason, or things could go around the CO and that information would be lost.
Yeah, that's just there's another thing this information has to be available. Like we need to the challenge is like if we decide to make this information like how many volumes of that particular type are used on a node, then it has to be available both on the node as well as on the controller actually, because like in case of scheduler will not be able to talk to the node directly, plugin running on the node directly. So it has to talk to some other agent and figure it out. And so to build a real use case of that, like how will it look like? I think we'll have to have a real use case. Okay, when we'll need that call. And I just don't feel comfortable enough designing that in right now in the use case that we have in Kubernetes to to make that call. That's my take. So it can be added like this. The change of the limit does not affect the threshold change that we are making does not affect the support to add that call in future. That's my take on it.
This feels kind of related to a problem that we talked about a while ago, which was, I think, related to Amazon EBS volumes, and that you have to know what the next free device name is in order to attach a disk to a node, and there was no way for a controller to know that because you could only know what the next free device is if you were talking to the node. This feels like there's kind of a similar, there's like a similar problem here, right? Where like you want to know things about the node, and you want to know those things so you can make decisions on the control plane. And like we don't really have a good way to surface that in CSI.
Yeah, I was thinking about where this kind of information should live, and I saw that the current implementation, it was proposed that it should be added to the node capabilities response. I don't think that's the right home for it. My feeling is that essentially what we're asking for is a bunch of attributes about a given node. We're going to overload get node ID to give us topology keys, but realistically, get node ID should have been called get node info, and it would include the node name, it would include labels that go on the node, also information like this, which is the maximum number of volumes that can be attached to the node, and possibly temporal information as well, such as the current number of volumes that are attached at that given point, though that is an open question. And then if we end up putting temporal information in there, it could theoretically also do things like the next free device name if we have some opaque parameters in that call. But that would mean that we either introduce a new get node info, or we rename get node ID to something else.
Yeah, that's true. And yeah, like for
I think you could do this in a non-breaking way. I mean, couldn't you do this purely additively? Like,
yeah, we could. So we could leave get node ID as is, and then mark it as deprecated, and then introduce get node info, where it would return the same information as get node ID does today, and then we can add additional information to it. And then for 1.0, we can pull get node ID out. I think that would be reasonable.
I think I like that idea, because
do you have to regulate for something, some fields should be static and some fields should be dynamic for this new call, or should we separate them into two new calls?
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm not sure. I haven't thought through that yet.
the one more thing is if we add a get node info, and like for example, if the controller part of the, like for example, just taking the EBS case, like, so get node node ID is a node call, right? It's not being called from the controller. I don't think it's accessible even from the controller, like the controller part of the plugin. So if we add a node info and controller needs to know which next device is available on the, just theoretically speaking, or like how many volumes are attached of that type on the node, and it's part of the node info, how is controller part going to make that call to the node info? Because that information. Yes,
sorry.
So far, the information that goes into get node ID is information that is, it has to go through the node object itself. So when the node object comes up, the plugin is registered. It does a get node info, gets information that is storage specific for that node, and then it pushes that back on, at least on the Kubernetes side, via the node API object. So for example, it'll create a new label to say, for this node, for this driver, this is what we believe the name is. And then in the future, we'll have labels for topology applied in a similar way. For a max volume count, it could also be an additional label on the node object. The problem is the temporal information. For example, the current count of volumes that are attached or the next EBS volume that you should use. It's unclear whether on the Kubernetes side labels are the correct way to surface that or not. We should probably have that discussion on the Kubernetes side though.
Also, it will be like racy actually. Like if you schedule a lot of volumes at once and a lot of parts with volumes at once, and the node object has to be updated and it might not update in time. So scheduler may still schedule nodes to the, parts to the node. So
it sounds like get node info should be static information that doesn't change over time. It's just identifying information about a particular node. Temporal information may make more sense in a controller call. This is just a crazy idea, but on the controller, we could have information about get node status or something. And it gives you an instantaneous snapshot of information about a given node. And if it's on the controller side, then the control plane components can use that information as it's information that's usually relevant to the control plane, not to the individual node.
I mean, the problem with that is that the information, like the origin of that information is actually the node. So you're kind of forcing, that's like a forcing function to plugins to like implement some kind of back channel. Yeah. It's either the plugins implement the back channel or the COs do. Ideally, we should force the CO to do the heavy lifting and make the plugins as simple as possible.
Yeah, I think I'm not saying like, I don't think we need to cross that bridge just yet. Maybe we should design it, but like for example, EBS case, currently we are, for the device names, we are caching this information in the driver itself, right? And like, that's how we do currently in EBS driver in Kubernetes. But we could do the same thing with the CSI EBS driver. It could cache the device that it allocates on the attach call. Obviously, that information is lost when the driver is restarted and stuff like that. That has been a problem since forever. So for now, but I am happy like we can just create a new node info call and add this information, the threshold limit in their static data.
So it sounds like I agree. Let's, you can't boil the ocean. Let's take it one step at a time. It sounds like having a new get in node info call would be useful. And for the time being, we could assume that get node info's response is going to be static. It's not intended to change over time. In the future, for these use cases, the next free device name, current attach count, we can decide whether we want to make get node info the home for this kind of information or a separate call, since that would be an additive change. And that way we can get the ball rolling on at least this. I would be okay with that. Any concerns with that approach?
I mean, the general approach, I think I'm okay with. I still have concerns about this threshold field. We talk about it as like an attach count, but like attach doesn't mean anything to CSI. There's controller published, there's node published, there's node stage. What does it mean to be attached? And how does a CO reason about something that's called, a number of volumes attached? Does that relate to the number of times stage was called? Does that relate to the number of times controller published was called?
So that's why I was trying. I mean, I do use attach word in the proposal, but it's like it's basically a number of maximum volume that you can use on the node. It doesn't matter if it is attached or published or staged. So the net result is like for example, EBS has a limit of 40, then you can use 40 volumes on the node maximum. It doesn't matter, stage, attach, or this thing. And the future, it just doesn't apply to EBS, but it does apply to every volume type that supports this, that has this limit, like DigitalOcean or GCPD or vSphere. So I'm not sure what actually vSphere, but like GCPD or like DigitalOcean or like EBS or other volume types. So the distinction at the threshold doesn't matter. It's just that we are using the word attach because that's like the word like we have been using a lot. I don't know if it makes sense.
I think the problem James is trying to raise is that CSI never actually uses the word attach. We typically shied away from using it because attach is very specific to a given implementation, and we wanted the spec to be more inclusive and allow for other things to happen inside of what we would call the attach step. And so when you write this into the spec, you need to actually define what attach means in the context of CSI. There's a couple of calls which are related to attach. There's a controller publish call, which currently corresponds to the Kubernetes attach call. But there's also a node stage call, which could be the equivalent of a local attach on the Kubernetes side. So we need to make sure that the language here is well defined and clear and works within the context of CSI. It's mostly just to make sure that folks who are reading this and don't understand what it is suddenly don't see a word that is nowhere else referenced anywhere else in the spec.
Okay. Yeah, I think I have not used the word, but I'll just double check and I'll rename the variable as we have discussed. Like so, actually we did not had a chance to talk about the name. So I agree. I will not use the attached word. And then the field itself, what should it be called? I think max volumes per node makes sense to me, but that's like we put this in the node info and we just call it max volume per node, and that seems like sensible because that does not have this distinction between a stage, attach, or publish, and that's pretty good because that's what I want this field to represent, not a specific stage of using a volume on the node. I don't want to just say, okay, you cannot stage, but you can probably publish. You can publish, but you cannot probably do node publish. I don't want to make that distinction. I just want to have like, okay, you can only use this many volumes.
I mean, the spec has to make that distinction for COs to reason about it, right? Like even if we don't embed that distinction in the name and we keep a short name, like the spec has to make a distinction with respect to behavior. Otherwise, the CO can't reason about what the value, what to do with the value of this field. So, I mean, I feel like there's some hand waving going on here, and I keep calling it out because like the spec has to be crystal clear about this. Otherwise, it's a useless field. Or it's only useful to one CO, which is not what we want.
So sorry, I might have missed some of the background discussion on this. I'm going to throw this out as a definition. So this field means max volumes that can be made available on a given node at the same time. Does this still leave room for confusion?
No, I think that's cool. That's perfect because that doesn't use a specific state, and that's fine.
I guess I would, what does it made available on a node? So that when I read that, I think, well, that's like a node staging or a node publish. It's one of those.
So the reason I say make available instead of a very specific call is that ultimately, whether you do a node stage or whether you do a controller publish or not, the intended end purpose of all these calls is to make the volume usable on a given node. And what I would like to see this definition be is not necessarily tied to a given sequence of possible calls. And instead of having to enumerate every single possible set of calls that could lead to a volume becoming available, just make that generic enough to say that any way in which you make a volume available, here is the maximum number of volumes that this plugin will allow per node.
So I could see this data getting out of date easily, especially if there's more than one thing attaching stuff, like even an admin just attaching stuff to the node. And there's no concept of, well, what's already on the node that the CO doesn't know about.
So I think what you're talking about is what we were discussing earlier, which is the current number of calls, which would definitely be out of date. The maximum number of volumes per node shouldn't really change over time.
Yeah, but there would have to be a single source of truth in terms of the current, and so therefore the max is useless. I would prefer to see an extra RPC that just says, you know, can I schedule something to this node right now? And you know, as a CEO, I might just go ahead and try to schedule something. If I get an error, then I'll say, well, is there any availability? If not,
Yeah.
okay, I'll keep that next time.
I think we have that call, right? So we have, for example, controller publish and node stage. If at any point you go through with one of those operations and the storage backend is unable to complete that operation, it's going to return an error.
Yeah.
So that's the state today. What's being proposed is giving the CO additional information so that it can proactively make smarter scheduling decisions. So before it actually goes and actually tries to do the equivalent of an attach operation, it should have some idea of what is going, like what is the maximum number that I can actually of a given volume that I can attach to a given node, so that if I have 100 workloads, I don't put them all on the same node. I can proactively make a smarter scheduling decision.
Yeah.
And so
I get that. I feel like this is only going to work in the perfect case. Like if there's anything else going on that node.
Yeah, I agree. I think having the maximum count alone is insufficient. Having the CO figure out what the current state is prone to bugs and getting out of sync eventually for various reasons. So I do think that we need a way to be able to probe and discover what the current count against a given node is. That said, we need to do that thoughtfully and carefully, because that information is temporal, it's dynamic, it changes over time, and we need to make sure that the call that we introduce that in makes sense. But I'm okay pumping the brakes on this and making sure that we consider this holistically instead of trying to rush this one component in.
A quick remark. So over the whole spec, we mostly use make available, or the available to node, this term in controller publish. So when someone say that, the first thing I can think of is controller publish, if you look at the spec.
Yeah, and I think, thanks, June. And I think for me, what's confusing is that, I guess, let's say a CO issues a controller publish call, and that controller, and then someone, because a CO wants to put a workload there on a node with a volume, right? So it issues a controller publish call, and then whatever, someone deletes that user intent, okay? So the volume's been controller published to the node, but it hasn't been node published or node staged or anything like that. Does that change what it means to be available? Or let's say controller publish succeeded and node stage succeeded, and then the workload was rescheduled, or removed or something. So in that case, is it still made available because node publish wasn't called? Like, because we're at this point now we're counting, right? Like something is trying to count slots.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Or something, right? And so there's these different states that the system can be in, and a CEO is never really sure like what it means to have one of those slots consumed.
Yeah, I think that's fair. That could happen, and then so what's the consensus? Do you want to consider the whole thing together? The actual measuring of how many volumes are being used or node will be tricky. And like as I said, it is racy, and we need to establish how the controller or the control plane will call this information from the node, or like how that information will be surfaced. We need to establish that, and we don't have a way of doing this in CSI right now. So, and we have a real problem like of users like like various volume plugin authors not able to use CSI because of this, because like for example, certain volume providers only schedule like 10 volumes to a node, and if they use CSI right now, it's like the CSI.
Can we take an action item to go back and take a look at the Kubernetes side of things and see if there's some way we can incorporate a current volume count into the Kubernetes design and see where it would make sense on the CSI side, and then come back to this meeting next week and report on the findings on that?
Yeah, actually, like the original proposal that I had in Kubernetes also included a current limit, but you might have seen it. But the reason I dropped it because it was racy, and there was no easy way to get rid of the race. Like when somebody schedules like 20 or 30 workloads at once, and because the information is like we schedule the pods or the workload, and then the volume driver updates the node, and then the node object should immediately be updated in the scheduler. So scheduler should pretty much check for everything it sends, and it might not immediately see the node change actually, and that's where the race was. And so we can go back to drawing board and we can discuss, but okay. So what is the consensus? I just want to see, like, should we, like Saad said, do you want to take this whole thing holistically and solve both the threshold problem and the current volume count problem together, or is this group happy with solving the threshold problem right now? Because from my end, like, we have like several users in desperate need of this proposal actually to make CSI basically usable.
Would it be helpful if the various RPCs that exists right now were to say, oh, this failed because we're at capacity, and then the CO can respond to that and like, oh, we need to move this to a different node or something of that nature.
So it already does.
That was what I was getting at earlier. Is like it's not easy to keep accounting. Like counting stuff on the node is pretty different. If the CEO wants to do that, it's up to the CEO.
But the point is that this is already the case. This already happens with both CSI and Kubernetes. If a maximum count is hit and it's not controlled by the scheduler, you do get an error from the backend storage on the equivalent of the controller publish call saying I've hit the maximum. So that already happens. The case that this is trying to optimize for is making the scheduler smarter. Kubernetes already has this logic built in, and the way that it's built in is it's basically hard-coded per in-tree volume plugin. For CSI, we can't make that assumption, right? We can't assume that every single volume plugin has the same limit.
Another limitation with the current approach is like once it's already too late when we throw that error in the current approach, when a node is already over the limit, that workload is never going to start. There's no logic to move that workload to a different part to a different node if the workload is failing on node X because of the attached limit. There's no logic. At least right now
that sounds like something we should fix on Kubernetes. I mean, that sounds like a CEO's problem and not the drivers.
Yeah, I mean that's not CSI's problem. But the CSI's problem is that there is at least one CEO, Kubernetes, which already implements this feature. And in order to be fully compatible, we need to be able to probe this.
Well, we could have the driver do something like back off once it, to always return that it's unschedulable or something if it hits an error from that node for a certain period. We don't have to know like the hard limit. You could just say, well, we got an error from this node. Let's not schedule anything to it for 20 minutes or whatever. And then we'll try again instead of keeping an active count.
Actually, like, because it will make more sense to have at least holistically to have the counts in some way, because like CPU, memory, those resources are counted, and the storage should be counted as well, because so that so that this should be stopped before scheduling itself. We should stop it. Otherwise, anything else like tainting like the node or marking the node as unsuitable, those things, yes, doable, but they will be ugly actually. So
yeah, it's like scheduling blindly. You can always just throw stuff around onto various nodes and figure out, oh, it doesn't fit, and then try to fix it. But that's not the way the scheduler is currently implemented on the Kubernetes side.
Yeah, storage should be first class resource, first class citizen, same as like other resources of a node. So
yeah. Okay, we've got 1 minute left. Can we get closure on this issue? Do folks, does anybody believe strongly that we should consider both the max and the current holistically together, or is it okay to tackle these independently and start with the max count first and then figure out how we can incorporate a current count?
Max is kind of useless, right? I mean, that could just be a configuration value that comes from the driver. I wouldn't expect like an AWS plugin to discover the number of devices. It's going to be some kind of hard-coded number someplace.
No, max is not useless. Max is like, you can figure it out from volume, like node type in AWS, or similarly in other types actually. So you know the type. GC similarly, you know the type of instance, and then
I don't expect the drivers to actually discover that, is what I'm saying. I mean, it's going to be a configuration value someplace.
Not necessarily. Like it could be default. There could be, yes, but the instance type, like for example, a C5 instance type in AWS will have like 28 volume type.
And that's available from an API call? You can make an API call to AWS and get the maximum count for a particular instance type?
You can make an API call to discover what the type of the volume, type of the node is, and then you can maintain an internal map from the type to
table. Yeah, so it's going to come back to like a table lookup.
Yeah, but I mean, ultimately, that's up to the plugin to decide what makes sense for it.
Yeah.
So if this is for making the schedule smart, I feel like the available, like what is remaining, what is available, how many can we still attach is more important than the max.
But that is same way as like just roundabout.
So you can calculate that today, right? If you're given a max, you can figure out how much is available based on what you've scheduled to that given node for that given volume type. So you can infer that information. And the proposal here is let's go with that as a starting point. The problem, of course, with that approach is that that internal count could be off for a multitude of reasons, due to bugs, due to the fact that somebody went around the CO and made a volume available. And if that's the case, the best way is to actually have some source of truth that we can go to rectify these values.
So I was wondering if every time we want to do this inference, like this calculation, then why not just provide it from the driver, the CSI plugin? Is that because it will complicate the plugin itself?
Couple of reasons. So the challenges are, one, figuring out where this value should be surfaced. Ultimately, the current count is something that should be consumed by the control plane of the CO, not necessarily the node, right? Whereas the max count is information that's specific to a given node. And the other problem is that the information becomes out of date very quickly. And if you have a lot of things going on in parallel, you could be racing with the value that the plugin gave you at a given time.
Yeah, okay, thanks, I got it.
That's going to be true even with just the max count. So, you know,
max count, the problem is not going to be on the CSI side. It'll be completely on the CO side. Like the CO thinks that the current count is this. If it's something else, the CO is miscalculated, basically.
Yeah. I mean, from a scheduling perspective, I would say, what availability do I have out there? Oh, this has 10 available. It says 2 available. Let me go ahead and try to schedule to one with 10 available. Rather than trying to figure out how many I've scheduled out and what the max count is, and hopefully nobody's attached something to that. And that's it, mixing up their numbers with my count and crazy stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
I would want that number to come straight from the storage provider and not me trying to reference count that. Especially
I'm thinking
internal to me and nothing else in the node.
I'm thinking that probably this can be done as a controller plugin API, but well, there's not much time, so I'll probably leave some comments on the PR.
Okay, so it sounds like there's no consensus on this. Let's take it to the PR, and we can pick this up as a discussion item for the next meeting.
Yeah, sounds good to me. Thanks, Todd.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Yeah.